Seven Senses. The Three Sacred Treasures Civilization Theory. Episode 1, The Three Sacred Treasures as a Civilization OSJewel Arc Part 2, Comparing Maslow and Kūkai. Can desire hierarchies expand into civilizational structure? The source of modern stagnation. Why is it that the harder people try, the less fulfilled they seem to become? Why is it that, even while looking at the same reality, people struggle so deeply to understand one another? Why is it that, despite becoming more convenient, life itself feels increasingly difficult? What if this is not merely an individual problem, but a problem rooted in the cognitive structure of civilization itself? If so, the world may begin to look entirely different. What we will explore today is this. Why do people conflict, even while looking at the same world? Throughout this series, we will examine civilization, consciousness, religion, AI, and human life through a single shared structure. That structure is the Three Sacred Treasures Civilization Theory, a proposed underlying operating structure of civilization itself. When an operating system changes, even the same machine behaves differently. Likewise, when cognitive structure changes, the movement of individuals, societies, and civilizations changes as well. What is Seven Senses? Seven Senses is a way of perceiving multiple forms of good as coordinates, transforming conflict into positioning and harmonization. The jewel discussed in this arc refers to the desire architecture that drives individuals, societies, and civilizations. The jewel is also a spherical cognitive structure, in which desires continuously expand, distort, reverse, and circulate. Human beings do not grow in a straight line. Instead, they shift the position of desire, through which they perceive the world. People return to old desires. They become biased. They reverse direction at boundaries. To say it is spherical means growth is not simply upward progression. In other words, the way reality appears changes depending on from which point one is viewing the world. A person may operate from order at work, from belonging within family, and speak from justice when discussing ideals. Someone calm yesterday may act entirely from fear today. In other words, human beings do not always perceive the world from the same position, and because of this, the judgments people make change depending on which layer of desire they are using to interpret reality. Seven Senses therefore asks not, which side is correct? But rather, where does it function? It is a cognitive structure that approaches different forms of good through positioning and harmonization rather than conflict. Today's theme. In this episode, we will compare the jewel structure of Seven Senses with two major systems: Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Kūkai's 10 stages of consciousness Jujushin. The important point here is not to claim these are the same theory. Rather, despite emerging from different eras and cultures, certain shared structural patterns of human understanding begin to appear. Today, we will examine those patterns structurally, reviewing the previous episode. Previously, we organized human desire into 7 layers. 1. Life. 2. Order. 3. Belonging. 4. Self. 5. Justice. 6. Reason. 7. Integration. The important point is this: human beings do not become entirely different beings. Instead, the range through which they perceive the world expands. Yet people unconsciously assume that their current layer of perception is the correct one. As a result, even while seeing the same reality, different perceptions of reality collide. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Psychologist Abraham Maslow organized human desire into a layered structure. Its foundation is simple. Human beings move to fulfill what is lacking, and once one desire is fulfilled, attention shifts toward another. Maslow's 5 stages. 1. Physiological needs. The desire to survive. 2. Safety needs. The desire for stability and security. 3. Social needs. The desire for belonging and connection. 4. Esteem needs. The desire to be recognized. 5. Self-actualization. The desire to live as oneself. Maslow positioned self-actualization as the highest point of human development. Yet in reality, beyond self-actualization, another question often emerges: what am I truly living for? Maslow and Seven Senses. Maslow's model primarily examines individual psychology. Seven Senses, however, extends beyond the individual to include society, religion, AI, and civilization itself. It is therefore a scale-expanded model. In other words, Beyond the realm of individual psychology explored by Maslow, civilizational questions begin to emerge. Correspondence between the models. Physiological needs life, safety needs order. Social and esteem needs correspond closely to belonging, as both involve confirming one's place within relationships. And then, self-actualization self. Up to this point, the structures align relatively closely, but seven senses continues beyond this. Desires 5-7, justice, meaning, and purpose. At this stage, the question arises, what am I living for? Worldviews, ethics, mission, and ideals begin to form. Reason, structural understanding. At this stage, the focus shifts away from which side is correct toward why does that perception of truth emerge at all? The concern is no longer opposing values themselves, but rather the structures that generate them. This stage does not deny morality or truth. Instead, it examines the conditions under which they emerge. What becomes important here is not good and evil themselves, but the observation of the structures that generate conflicting perceptions of reality, integration, positioning, and harmonization. Finally, instead of forcing different forms of good into opposition, people begin positioning them according to where each functions best. Positioning does not mean accepting everything equally, nor does it mean fixing superiority and inferiority. It means understanding where each thing functions most appropriately. This is the stage where one moves beyond rigid correctness and begins treating reality through positioning, harmonization, and integration. Kūkai's 10 stages of consciousness. Next, we examine Kūkai's Jujushin. Here, we approach it as a model describing the expansion of cognition and world understanding. Who was Kūkai? Here, we view Kūkai not only as a religious figure, but also as a thinker who systematized the deepening of human perception itself. What made Kūkai unique was that he treated enlightenment not merely as a transcendent spiritual ideal, but as something that could be lived and practiced within reality itself. In an age accelerated by AI and information overload, what matters increasingly is not simply, what do you know? But rather, through what structure do you perceive the world? What is Jujushin? Jujushin describes how cognition and world understanding expand over time. This is not intended as a strict doctrinal explanation, but rather as a simplified structural overview on instinct. 2. Order. 3. Desire. 4. Self-awareness. 5. Ethics. 6. Social awareness. 7. Separation of subject and object. 8. Structural understanding. 9. Relational understanding. 10. Embodiment of the world itself. This is the overall flow, Jujushin in 7 senses. This structure also shows a degree of correspondence with 7 senses. Life 1, Order 2, Belonging 3, Self 4, Justice 5, 6, Reason 7, 9, Integration 10. The important point here is this. The differences between people are not fundamentally differences of ability or superiority. They are differences in which layer of reality they are perceiving from. The underlying structure. Maslow Kūkai, 7 senses. These are not identical theories, yet across different scales. Psychology, consciousness, civilization, they all appear to describe a movement in human cognition, from outer to inner, from separation to integration, from deficiency to positioning. Each system seems to describe this same movement through different language. Differences in perception. Even when watching the same news, life asks, is this dangerous? Order asks, how do we protect stability? Belonging asks, how are others reacting? Self asks, what does this mean for me? Justice asks, is this morally right? Reason asks, what structure produced this perception? Integration asks, how should this be positioned within the whole? In other words, people are not truly fighting while seeing the exact same world. They are interpreting the same reality from entirely different layers of perception. The Rubik's Cube analogy. 7 senses is like a Rubik's Cube. When looking at only one side, that side appears to be the entire world. But once the whole structure becomes visible, each face can be understood in terms of where it belongs within the whole. The goal is not to deny one side, but to position it properly within the larger structure. Conclusion. At this point, we can see that the dual structure of 7 senses shares certain structural correspondences with Maslow's psychological model, Kūkai's consciousness model, Maslow explored individual desire. Kūkai explored the expansion of consciousness. Seven Senses attempts to reorganize these ideas at the scale of civilization itself, using a single structure to interpret human beings, society, religion, AI, and civilization. Modern stagnation is not caused merely by the increasing complexity of the world. Rather, it emerges because our cognitive structures remain outdated, while the world itself has become multi-layered. What modern civilization needs, therefore, is not the victory of one form of truth. It is the development of a cognitive structure capable of approaching different forms of truth, not through conflict, but through positioning and harmonization. That is the update point of the Civilization OS, proposed by the dual structure of seven senses. Before changing the world, we may first need to update the way the world itself is perceived. Perhaps the crisis of modern civilization is not ultimately a crisis of information, but a crisis of perception. Civilization changes when perception changes. Next episode, in part 3, we will expand the scale further. From the individual, to society, to civilization, to the planet itself, and explore how cognitive structures shape civilization itself.